Joy nearly got lost on the route-knotted red dirt path off of Highway 99, losing sight of the gaps between the live oaks and Spanish moss that fanned across her hood and windows like fingertips. Driving back to her family's cabin 20 years later reminded her that the woods had rarely been restful for her. Once, Dad had made her play outside instead of sitting on the couch with her Virginia Hamilton books, and she'd stepped in an antelope to her shin. She howled so loudly from the vicious stinging that Dad and Mom heard her all the way from the lake, and when they reached her they expected to find her half dead. She'd never forgotten that wild, frightened look in their eyes. No, Joy did not like the woods. If she'd started her trip closer to dark, she would have had to turn around and wait out the night at the overpriced Hampton Inn off of I-10, but her father's old Bronco finally appeared in the glare of orange dusk light fighting through the treetops, parked in front of the cabin. And the cabin looked so small, much smaller than she remembered. The trees and wildly growing ferns dwarfed it, with no obvious path to the door from the red-brown dirt driveway. She'd imagined that she and her brother might fix the cabin up as a rental one day, but in real life it was puny and weather-beaten and sad, more relic than residence. Their great-grandfather built this cabin in the 1920s to hide from lynch mobs roused by their envy that a Negro businessman could afford a shiny new Ford Model T. Every inch of the cabin was sagging 100 years later, weary of standing. The slanted roof had collected a thick blanket of dead leaves at the heart of the L shape that separated the cabin's main room from its single bedroom. The bathroom her parents had added in the rear in the 90s wasn't in great shape, Jessie had warned, but it was better than the outhouse she still saw a few yards beyond the cabin, its wood blackened with age. How had Dad been living there alone for 2 months? Maybe longer if her brother's theory was true that he'd moved into the cabin soon after Mom's funeral a year ago. Almost to the day. How? She said aloud. Gaps between walls, wooden slats gaped like missing teeth, so the cabin probably had no insulation just when the weather was getting cold. Joy was wearing a jacket and it wasn't dark yet. North Florida wasn't New York, where she lived now, but it wasn't South Florida either. The temperature was dipping to the 40s at night. Jessie had warned her to bring extra blankets to supplement the coal stove, which was still the main heating source. The cabin looked abandoned, but dim light bled through the threadbare curtains she recognized in the window, the ones with patterns of fish Mom had found at a garage sale with Joy a million years ago. Or yesterday. Time was a mystery and a lie since Mom had died. Joy was glad that Dad wasn't waiting outside, since she might have forgotten to prepare herself to see him look smaller too. Thinner. More frail. Grayer. Jessie had warned her what to expect after his visit a week ago. The reason she was here, but she might have forgotten if the cabin had looked anything like she remembered it. Joy checked her cell phone. NOSIGNAL. Shit. No wonder Dad never picked up his cell phone. Jessie said he'd made an appointment to install a landline, but the technician couldn't come for another 30 days. She wished he could call Jessie now. She was a year older, but he was a better fit for this job. He'd been deployed in Afghanistan most of Mom's last year with cancer, so Joy was the one who had cleaned and fed her and raged at negligent nurses. They both knew it was Jessie's turn now. She could not have faced another round of nursing home applications and medical assessments on her own, not so soon. Jessie had already taken Dad to a neurologist in Jacksonville to confirm the dementia they already suspected before Mom died. But Jesse's last visit had worried him so much that he'd promised Joy he would drive from Jacksonville to stay with Dad in the cabin every weekend. He just wanted to be sure she didn't think Dad needed more than that. All he'd asked from Joy was one weekend. Stay there in the cabin with him a couple nights, he'd said. Observe his life. Let's compare notes on what we think we should do. Then Jesse had held her forearm and stared her in the eye. But he loves it out there, Joy. He really wants to be in that cabin. That's the only thing that makes him happy. If she'd realized what Jesse really meant, she would not have come alone. Joy heard her father's terrible cough before she reached the door. For a couple of years, Joy had a friend during their family visits to the cabin. It turned out that a white family lived in a lake house only a quarter-mile away, an easy walk if you knew where to look. The two kids were miraculously close to their ages: a daughter, Natalie, who was 10 like Joy, and a son, Nate, who was only a year older than Jesse. For 2 summers and 2 winters, Joy and Natalie had tried every way they knew to entertain themselves in the woods. Collecting tadpoles, tracking butterflies, kicking over ant mounds in vengeance, whittling figures from fat twigs, smoking cigarettes Natalie stole from her mother. Anything that wasn't fishing. Natalie was the one who told her about the wishing pool, which was midway between their properties, nestled between 2 ancient live oaks that bent toward each other as if to hug. It was more like a puddle than a pool. Joy had always thought, maybe 6 feet across, so shallow that the green-brown water only reached their knees, although Natalie cautioned against ever touching the water. It's for wishes, Natalie said. Touching the water ruins them. For their first wish, they kept it simple. They wished for a dog. They didn't think it through, exactly. They didn't live together or even see each other outside of short visits, so they didn't have a clear picture of what that joint dog ownership would look like. But the next morning, when Joy was arguing with her brother over who had to wash the dishes piled in the cabin's tiny sink, she heard a happy bark outside. She rushed to the window and saw Natalie with a grin that filled her face. A black and white dog, coat a bit mudded, was running in circles around Natalie. Just like that, they had their dog. Dad said it looked like a terrier mix of some kind, 100% pure mutt, and filthy at that, but they were ecstatic. No color identified an owner who might be looking for him, so the dog was theirs. They named their dog Lucky because, well, the obvious. Lucky fetched sticks no matter how far they threw them, helped them sniff out rabbit holes, barked protectively at any strange rustlings, and generally made everything they did 10 times more fun. They washed, combed, and groomed him until he looked like he belonged on TV. They worked out a joint custody arrangement with their parents. Natalie would keep Lucky until the Christmas visit to the cabin, and then Joy could take him until summer. But none of that happened. The day Joy was scheduled to go home, Natalie knocked on the cabin door teary-eyed and said Lucky had crawled out of her house and wouldn't come when she called. From the first time she heard, Joy knew the dog was gone. She wasn't surprised to learn, on her next visit, that Natalie had never seen Lucky again. She decided their wish had not been specific enough. They should have said they wanted a dog to keep. Natalie had changed in the 6 months Joy had been away, a bit thinner, not smiling as much, bored with tadpoles and butterflies. The wishing pool had shrunk to only half its previous size, the water more brown than green. Joy assumed they would wish to bring Lucky back, but Natalie just shrugged and said she didn't want a dog anymore. My wish is for my parents to get a divorce, Natalie said. That wish was unimaginable to Joy, but Natalie said her parents fought so much that she'd rather they split up and get separate houses. She'd mapped it all out: 2 Christmases, 2 summer vacations, guilt presents. So Natalie threw the shiny penny in the pool, closed her eyes, and said, "Please let my parents split up." Joy was both scandalized and thrilled. The secret felt better than smoking. But the wish didn't come true. At least not right away. The next summer, when Joy knocked on Natalie's door, a tenant answered and said they had sold the house after the owner was killed by a drunk driver. Natalie, Joy had said, hardly able to speak. The tenant soothed her. "No, honey, the little girl and her mom are fine. They lost the daddy, though." "Please let my parents split up," Natalie had said. As an adult, Joy told the story often with a breezy air, never confessing how she'd walked far out of her way to avoid the wishing pool ever since. How maybe it was the wishing pool, not the boredom of fishing, that had sired her on visiting the cabin with her parents after she graduated from high school. How the wishing pool had ended her childhood. Joy, Dad said, the nickname he'd made up for her. He grinned, his teeth unchanged, stripping 30 years from his face. That would be her happiest memory of this visit, his eyes bright with surprise and delight when he called her by the name that belonged to him alone. Then another cough came, terrible, swaying him until he steadied himself against the doorframe. He sounded winded despite the cannula in his nostrils, tube snaking to rest heavy in a pocket of his robe. He was wearing piss-stained long underwear and a threadbare robe. Joy wanted to burst into tears. Somehow, she didn't, leaning in for a casual hug. She was relieved that the nape of his neck smelled the same. She clung to every grace. "Surprise, Dad." She hadn't realized how good an actress she was. Jesse hadn't told her the most important thing: Dad was dying. Maybe Jesse was hiding it from himself. She'd seen plenty of death up close with Mom, so she knew it when she saw it. The shriveled frame. The dark shadows beneath his eyes. That cough. How could Jesse have left Dad like this even for a day? If she'd had a phone, she would have called for an ambulance already. Well, why the heck didn't you call when you got to town? Dad said, "I am a mess." "I would have he surveyed himself down better, pumpkin." He coughed a river of phlegm. She took his arm so thin and led him back inside, nudging the door closed with her heel so no heat would escape. The coal stove glowed golden orange through the grate, but it must be burning embers. The front room was cold, so his bedroom must be frigid. She wanted to take out a notebook and start making a list of the urgent things he needed. Heat. Clothes. Medicine. Chronicling it in her head dispassionately kept her lip from trembling. "I'll help you put a few clothes in your bag. Then I need to take you to a doctor." Dad waved an impatient hand over his shoulder before he opened the stove's door and stirred the dying coals. "I am not going to talk about that." Joy's silence finally wore him down. They had always had a kind of telepathy, weathering Mom and Jesse's emotional storms with telling glances. "I've already seen the doctors, Joya. There's nothing I can do. It just has to play out. That's that. Ask your brother." "We're not going to talk about it." So Jessie did know more, probably had heard a diagnosis. She'd fought so hard not to be irritated at Jesse, but now she was furious. Jesse was doing it again. He was hiding behind her.